found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon. When he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. "Sorry," he grunted, as the tiny old woman stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset by being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said, in the squeaky voice that made the passerby stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourselves should be celebrating this happy, happy day." Then the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot, and he had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he had been called a muggle. Whatever that was, he was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off for home, hoping he was imagining things which he'd never had hoped before, because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and didn't approve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted that morning, and it was now sitting on his garden wall. He made sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around its eyes. "Shoo!" said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior, Mr. Dursley thought, trying to pull himself together. He let himself into the house, and he was determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had a nice, normal day, and she told him all over about dinner, about Mrs. Next Door's problems with her daughter, and how Dudley had learned a new word, won't. Mr. Dursley had tried to act normally, but when Dudley had been put to bed, he went to the living room to catch the last report on the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported the nation's owls have been behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night, they are hardly ever seen in daylight. There have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newscaster allowed himself a grin. Most mysterious. And now, over to Jim McGuffin with the weather. Going to any more showers of owls tonight, Jim? "Well, Ted," said the weatherman, "I don't know about that, but it is only not the owls that have been acting odd lately. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of rain I promised yesterday, they had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have celebrate bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight." Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars? All over Britain? Owls flying by daylight? Mysterious peoples in cloaks all over the place? And a whisper about the Potters? Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. Petunia, dear, have you heard anything from your sister lately, have you?" And as he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they had normally pretended she didn't have a sister. "No. Why?" "Funny stuff on the news. Owls, shooting stars, and there were a lot of funny-looking people in town today." "So?" "Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, like her crowd." Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered if he dared tell her that he heard the name Potter. He decided that he didn't dare. Instead, he casually said, "Their son. He'd be about Dudley's age by now, wouldn't he?" "I suppose so," said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. What's his name again? Howard, isn't it?" "Harry." Nasty common name, if you ask me. Oh, yes, said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. Yes, I quite agree. He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley kept to the bedroom window and peered down to the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as though it was waiting for something to happen. Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair as well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well that he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could be mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them, right? How very wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat in the wall was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting outside, as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Privet Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when a car door slammed in the next street, nor when two owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner, and the cat had been watching, appearing so suddenly and silently you would have thought he'd just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched, and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen on Privet Drive. He was tall, thin, very old, and judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt, he was wearing long robes, a purple cloak that swept the ground, and high-heeled buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had not been broken at least twice. The man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived in a street where everything from his name to his boots was unwelcome. He was busy rummaging through his cloak, looking for something, and he did seem to realize that he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason he chuckled and muttered, "Ha, I should have known." He found what he was looking for inside his pocket. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open, held it up in the air, clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered out in the darkness. 12 times he clicked the put-outer. With the only lights left in the whole street were the two tiny pinpricks in the distance, which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked at the window now, even beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't be able to see anything that was happening out on the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the put-outer back inside his cloak and set off down the street toward number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing you here, Professor McDonald." He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses, exactly the shape of the markings on the cat had around its eyes. She, too, was wearing a cloak, an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun, and she looked distinctly ruffled. "How did you know it was me?" "My dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly." "You'd be stiff if you'd been sitting on a brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall. All day? When you could have been celebrating? I must have passed a dozen feasts and parties on my way here. Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. Oh, yes, everyone's celebrating all right, she said impatiently. You'd think they'd be a bit more careful, but no. Even the muggles have noticed something's going on. It was on their news. She jerked her head back at the Dursleys' dark living room window. I heard it. Flocks of owls. Shooting stars. Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something. Shooting stars down in Kent.